Good morning. Delighted to be here. And as always, this is a great session. I have to say, when I come to this, I feel like I've probably gone to the best meeting of the year as far as focus and balance. What I'm going to be doing, I'm sort of, you can tell, in the breastfeeding section, and transitional feeding or complementary feeding often is tied and temporally and sometimes emotionally into that same story. Also, what I was asked to do was to look over sort of what's being done. This won't be as evidence-based, in part because there is very little evidence, but also to talk about what's going on in practice, what is the Academy of Pediatrics saying, and then to have some time sort of as commentary about how might one integrate all these things. So certainly to start, there really is little scientific evidence to support what any number of us, whether it's WIC or the Academy of Pediatrics or private practice pediatrics office, is saying is best practices. Although when you talk to families, they almost always feel like they have been told to do this, 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 and this. So we come across that way. I'm saying that because as you and we think about future public health policy, it is the nature of our times to try to understand what's evidence-based and what's expert opinion and what's culturally experienced. So big part of that has to do with infant feeding. The time I'm talking about might be defined as from about 4 months to 24 months, that time it takes an infant to go from feeding as an infant to really being at the table with the rest of the family and being able to eat pretty much whatever. It is, of course, about energy and macronutrients, but in our country and in our culture, the energy issue is not usually a problem, and I applaud Dr. Butte and the new work because I think that's seminal and will help define thinking about this better. Macronutrients are so macronutrients, plenty of protein in our diet. We heard the debates about what's the right fat and fat intake. Often in transitional feeding, though, we do end up talking a bit more about iron and zinc, and then vitamin D, which we won't take time today, linking that back to breastfeeding practices and the changes that have come there. So when you think about iron and zinc and what's been happening scientifically, I would say over the last decade, looking at U.S. common practices versus the evidence, our culture has been one for the last 50 or 60 years. I didn't look up when infant cereals first started being marketed, but that has became to be seen as first foods in our country. And it got a lot of traction because of the iron fortification. And of course, the biggest risk physiologically for the infants in this transition is becoming iron deficient anemic. What's been happening over the last 5, 6, 10 years is that there's evidence that should get us to reconsider that or consider that we have other choices. And the discussions and the projects looking at using flesh foods, using that as a general comments for meat, and nutritionally, then we know you have to go to sort of subcategories, what's a red meat, what's chicken or fish, and how all of these would be able to deliver highly bioavailable iron in the small amounts that toddlers take solid foods. Zinc is a little bit more complicated. It is another at-risk nutrient for a few months in there, and it certainly has physiological consequences. It certainly goes along with the red meats, but the pork and chicken are a little less source here. So those will have to continue to be issues, but I really wanted to bring up if we had this discussion 10 years ago, we wouldn't even spend 15 seconds on the infant cereal question, and I think its time has come. So given that there is not a lot of evidence about do this and you get better health outcomes, I thought I would spend just a moment again on the things that are fairly evidence-based. We know that the GI tract is pretty much fully mature by 2 to 3 months of age, so that the infant can actually tolerate most kinds of foods if it gets into the small intestine safely, which is about texture and chewing and swallowing and all of that. The gross motor function, we always think about, if you will, the truncal development. Can the child sit in an infant seat and hold up well enough to be able to receive food by spoon, by mouth? And in children who are typically developing, that goes on from about the 4 to 7 months. The oral motor issues are really those often thought of as sort of the primitive reflex. Can you put the food in the mouth and the baby not spit it out? So the tongue thrust reflex. Some of these other, the really well-developed startled reflex, all these kinds of things. So that goes on and is certainly fully done by 6 months. Self-feeding, fine motor skills, and again, to start transitional feedings, we're not giving the baby a spoon, so you don't have to get to self-feeding straight away. One of the most interesting things that I think has happened in the literature, and for which there is new evidence, and I think a growing body of evidence, is there may be an optimal time for the introduction of these non-liquid formula milk-based foods that has to do with acceptance of taste and texture. And we know from some of that early exposure that it does have some influence on foods accepted as a child, and really a little bit of data saying it influences what you eat on into your life. So with that as background, where are we today? Well, certainly, as I said, there's a reason this talk is with all the breastfeeding stuff, because this is often seen as something that is of detriment to breastfeeding patterns. And that concept of exclusive breastfeeding is one that, again, I'll encourage us to sort of think through, and I think from the comments this morning, say a few other things. But at the WHO levels, I mean, we're all familiar with the big reports, and they want breastfeeding through the first 6 months, and that has much to do with health and safety and clean water and infectious disease that aren't really pertinent to us. In the US, the Academy of Pediatrics has sort of said, yes, we'll take the WHO, but we'll say approximately 6 months. And if you followed the politics and the policy of the Academy, and I am a pediatrician, so my Academy of Pediatrics, over the years, you'll see it's 6 months, or it's 4 months, or it's 4 to 6 months. Again, just reflecting, of course, that there's not strong evidence for health of the babies for any of those. As we have gone through important research over the last decade, I think it is clear now there is limited evidence that early feeding, breastfeeding or not breastfeeding, as a mode of feeding has a lot of influence on obesity. Many of those other things that relate to breastfeeding initiation or duration, and again, even some of the things Nancy was talking about, total calories ingested. I'm not saying that early feeding doesn't have something to do with obesity, because obesity is about calories and physical activity. But for a while, we were attributing exclusive breastfeeding as being highly protective for obesity. I don't think that evidence supports that as strongly anymore. Other things that we hear about in pediatrics all the time, and we've had a good last year or so. It's very unusual for pediatric nutrition questions to make it to the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA. But I wanted to show you a couple of reports that I'm sure in your evidence, literature review, but atopic disease has been one that we have been trying to improve outcomes related to breastfeeding, and there's no strong evidence that you change atopic disease in high-risk children about how you feed them breastfeeding or not. The article that's just like hot off the press on peanut allergies. This, again, will be a groundbreaking paper, hopefully that will be supported from some other very large studies. But this really dispels the myth that the right thing to do is to not expose young children to peanuts. From this paper, and I really do encourage you to read it, early exposure before the first year, so 4 to 11 months, actually decreased the occurrence of peanut allergy. Peanut allergy is important because when kids have it, they can have anaphylaxis and die from it. So I'm not trying to diminish its importance. And it's tripled and quadrupled in the US and in many other parts of the world. But we've spent a lot of time saying, oh, well, we have to worry about that peanut butter being in the household because, maybe, so new things there. Celiac disease, whether you delay introduction of gluten-containing foods, going back to the infant cereals, or that you have longer breastfeeding did not influence the ultimate occurrence of celiac disease in high-risk children. Nor did using hydrolyzed formula reduce type 1 diabetes in children at age 7. So we are gaining an evidence-based, but many of the things we were attributed to very specific feedings may not hold up as we go forward, which in many ways I think is a good thing for WIC because we really are about basically healthy children and trying to move that forward. So this last bullet point was the one that as I was listening to my colleagues speak, I made all my other comments on. This is a great paper that came out, and I used it when I prepared this just to talk about, again, what is it going to do to get breastfeeding more popular. And it's another one of the papers that shows it seems the key factor is the support. Here it was maybe in Sweden. It was in a Scandinavian country where we already have great healthcare systems, much less poverty than we do, and they're still trying to find out what the right influence is. So what I wanted to mention, I think, that didn't get said as clearly as I would recommend, the biggest thing that has happened over the last little while in breastfeeding, and whether mothers initiate breastfeeding or not, in my view, it's not WIC. I think we've been supportive, but it's the baby-friendly hospital initiatives. I have often doing studies where I'm recruiting infants in that first 72 hours of life. I'm right there, or my team is right there on the floor, and the ability to do a study on formula feeding is infinitely harder now than it was because the hospitals are pushing with such determination that sometimes it's considered a little over the top, a little too aggressive, that if a woman truly doesn't want to breastfeed, she leaves the hospital feeling guilty. Or she may have lied to the nurses to just like, I don't want to talk about this anymore. And I know this sounds anecdotal, but I really do believe it's one of the big things going on. So the good thing out of that is breastfeeding initiation is higher. Every study we see shows that. I don't necessarily think we can attribute that to the changes in the WIC program, but we absolutely want WIC to be aligned with breastfeeding initiation for women, that is a good choice. So all the education, the support, but I think that's an important piece. I think the issue of the breastfeeding consultants, peer counselors, people in the hospitals, social media, breast pumps, all of those are things that make this more possible. Now, I'll probably say the thing, again, if I were at a breastfeeding conference, that would get me thrown out. But as a pediatrician, I'm very happy with mixed feeding, especially after the first 2 or 4 weeks of life. That the real huge clear evidence impact is in the initiation, it's in the early feeding. And again, in our population, low-income moms are not the people getting, 12-week maternity leaves. So how do we help support initiation of breastfeeding? I would encourage us to think about the role of mixed feeding, sustained long breastfeeding, but partial breastfeeding is not a failure. It's one of the things that can be one of our successes. So that those issues of return to work, of childcare, of just even the chaos of living in these situations. So I think that all of these things are part of what we're trying to go forward with. So back to, I don't think transitional feeding is the enemy of breastfeeding. I think it's an important part of child development, and what we want to do is have WIC make it work. So the WHO is talking about the role of flesh foods and eggs. In the US, we still seem to be a little stuck in thinking of this order. Cereals, fruits, vegetables, and meats are last. I think that needs to be reconsidered from the evidence, and then that influences what we teach. The AAP paradigm, the suggestion now is meats and vegetables with higher iron be introduced on par with the concept of infant cereals. And even now, based on the evidence of taste and texture acceptance, the AAP is talking about the importance of introducing all the food groups at the same time. So we're going to go away from you do cereals and fruits and then vegetables and then meats. And in fact, there are early data that support we ought to get all the food groups in that first month or two of starting solid feedings. So again, that we have a broader acceptance, a broader palate, and in fact, a better diet for the babies. So full variety, if one were to start at 6 months of age with feeding, a full variety within a month or two, and that's where I picked the 7 to 8. The AAP is still aligned with no cow milk during the first 12 months, and I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that should be changed. In general, switching to whole cow milk when you wean from breast milk or formula after a year. The concept of using lower fat milk for individual children who come from families who have history of obesity or lipids, the lipid disorder or cardiovascular disease. That's very much in the relationship of the doctor, nurse, dietitian, family discussion. And it's also brought up as if the individual child is gaining excess weight. So that's been out there for quite a while. We have not had huge numbers of case reports showing terrible failure to thrive in children who are put on low-fat milk. I think that has come along very nicely. The AAP is, as has WIC, talked about limiting juice. Here, the numbers on the books are 4 to 6 ounces after 6 months, along with no juice before 6 months. There was this wonderful report that was from 2012, and it was really about the cash voucher for the vegetable program, and I hope the committee has it. I found it's probably the most interesting reading and preparing for this. So I got very interested in, are we doing a good job, and how would we find out in something other than measuring growth and body composition? So this is the monthly redemption pattern. Only 13% of the WIC prescriptions sampled in Kentucky, Michigan, and Nevada as the study picked up everything, so full redemption. And there is a big variety across that based on your ethnic background, with the Asian participants at 25% and the Black participants at 9%. To me, that's something I didn't know. It's addressable. We need to deal with that. Now, the good news is 82% of the people who come and sign up at WIC actually do pick up some of their WIC foods. 5% never show. I figure 5%, life changes, you move on. But I really am concerned about, I would have thought full redemption, given what we think of as the product being the quality and the availability and the new improvements. So that was interesting. The other thing I looked at was the issue about, in the program, what are the most popular things and the least popular things? So the most popular things here over on the left, obviously, and that goes to the question of what do people think WIC is? People think WIC is a program to go get infant formula. It still drives it. It is our heritage. We've certainly changed it a bit. But infant formula, milk, the cash vouchers for fruits and vegetables and eggs. Over here on the other side are some of the things that I wish, let's see if this works, that I wish moved over to the most popular side. The jarred baby meats, the jarred fruits and vegetables are things that I think if we can build this in WIC, we will have the chance to have a real impact on the nutritional status of infants. So in my yellow light moment, these are the things I would consider. As has been said, we all have to remember that WIC is a supplemental food program. We are not responsible for all of the food in the home for the baby, but we want to do the very best we can with the money we're spending And I believe fundamentally, WIC has to always be aware, of its public health. So things I think we might consider in changing and might reflect better outcomes when we're looking at this 5 years from now. I'm somebody who really thinks we need to start separating the fruit and vegetable thing, and those are different stories. Very much need increased vegetables, and I think increased flesh foods in my talk in this transitional time. The decrease in intake of juice, possibly WIC doesn't need to be providing juice because it's not needed in this age group. Faster introduction of foods I've mentioned, pushing the jarred fruits and vegetables. Lactation support I think is key, and the the issue of it's got to be cost neutral. So what are the things that you as a committee are going to have to support by saying if we want these new and improved ideas, what are we willing to take off? So those are some of the things. And personally, I believe we should be giving the fruits and vegetables and meats to all babies. We started it as a breastfeeding incentive, and we took it out of the partial. I think we need to reconsider that from a public health point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. Don't go away.
Oh,
Thank you so much. If the other members could come on up, the other presenters, and in the meantime, if there are any clarification questions for Dr. Stallings from the committee or consultants. Okay.